All right, welcome to the presentation for vehicles. I'm actually kind of excited that nobody signed up for this week, or perhaps that the people who signed up dropped out of the class, because that lets me talk a bit. I love this reading. It's one of my absolute favorites of all time. It was written by this guy who looks kind of like Santa Claus or something, Valentino Brighton, and his research is in neuroanatomy and the mechanism of brain function. So I guess you can't really see anything in the background where he's at, but basically this is somebody who's really looking at the brain on a neuronal level, is really interested in low-level mechanisms, right? So if you have somebody who's studying brain cells, they're naturally going to wonder, okay, how do I get from this brain cell to a person, right? How can I explain a person in terms of a bunch of these individual cells? And that's why he created this book, which is like a children's story, which can make it a little bit strange to read because we've been reading all these journal articles and you have this transition from very formal writing to this, and you're like, what the heck is going on? But I love that about it because it's like a children's story, and he is kind of vague in some ways and lets you fill in the blanks yourself, which is fun because there's many ways that we can fill in the blanks, right? So the basic idea with this is that it shows intelligent behavior without rules, without concepts, and without other representations, okay? So in these vehicles, there's no place where you can say, oh, that's where the rule is stored, or that represents the concept. And why this is awesome is because it lets us kind of poke at the question, what do we need to represent the mind? Do we need to have explicit rules? Do we need to have explicit concepts? And the basic case from this paper is no, we don't need that. So you can get that with the first vehicle. First vehicle is one sensor and one motor. I'm sure you guys all followed this, but I'm just going to describe it anyway. So if you're looking at this diagram here, the half circle is the sensor. The arrow is the direction of travel, and the thing in the back that's kind of like a little rectangle that's poking out the rear, that's the motor. You can think of it as being a wheel. That's the way I like to think about it. I like to think of these things as having wheels. So the basic idea is light hits the sensor and it makes energy, like a solar panel. Light hits a solar panel, it makes electricity. There's a wire from the sensor to the motor. Electricity runs through it. And when that electricity hits the motor turns, right? And the whole thing goes forward. So in this case, if it's going towards light, if the sensor is keyed for light, then it's just going to go through light. And once it goes through, there's no longer light in front of it, it'll just stop. And to me, this is like a bacteria. It's very similar to like chemotaxis. There's a chemical gradient in the environment of some bacteria, and it's just responding to the chemical gradient, and its little flagella is propelling it forward. I mean, the materials may be different, but the basic idea seems to be very similar. All right, so that's vehicle one. What about vehicle two? So vehicle two is actually my favorite, and this is what I think of when I think of vehicles, because this one is so simple, and yet it creates two very different behaviors just by changing how the wires are wired up. Okay, so in this case, you got two sensors and two motors. Sensors are still these half-circly things in the front, and the motors are still the rectangular things in the back, right? So now I've got two wheels in the back, and I've got headlights, practically. Now, the only difference between these two is whether the wires go straight back or whether they cross. And in a way, I think this is neurologically a very interesting question because, as you probably remember from other classes, your brain actually is crossed in some ways, right? The right side of your body is wired into the left side of your brain and vice versa, all kinds of stuff. It's crossed. Why would that happen? Why is that interesting? Well, it may actually have happened someplace way back because of the same properties that drive this vehicle, right? So if it's parallel and both sensors are keyed to the same stimuli, like light, then it's going to avoid the light, right? Because what happens is that the sensor that's closer to the light will get more energy it'll make that wheel turn faster than the wheel that's away from the light. It'll cause the whole thing to turn away from the light. Whereas if it's crossed, it'll approach, right? So that's kind of interesting. I mean, it's very speculative and everything, but if you think about the way that our sensory systems are crossed, like visually at least, it seems like it's a little bit more wired at a basic level for approach. I don't know. That's very speculative, but it's kind of interesting to think about that parallel. So basic idea with vehicle 2, same sensors, same motors, you wire differently, you either get an avoidance behavior or an approach behavior. He calls it fear and aggression. I like avoidance approach. All right, vehicle 3. All right, so same kind of idea, 2 sensors and 2 motors, but now instead of the electricity kind of flowing back from the sensor to the motor and making it turn, now the basic idea is that the motor is always on, right? And it's only the electricity feeding back that's applying the brakes. So if there's no brakes, it's just spinning around, going everywhere. But as soon as it gets to a light, and the light is bright enough that it really clinches the brakes and keeps those wheels from spinning, that creates this love kind of behavior, like it stays at the light and it doesn't want to leave. So the basic idea with this is that it now introduces the idea of inhibitory connections. Okay, so vehicle 3C. Now I'll add all of these together, right? All of our different kinds of connections, and he does this. Now they're not just half circles, but they're like V's and U's and stuff. And theoretically, you could get a mixture of all these little kinds of behaviors depending on what the sensors were keyed into. For some things, it might avoid that, right? So avoid the predator, right? My predator sensor is firing. Avoid the predator. Other things, it might be like food. It might like, woohoo, I need to go after that. That's some food. I'm going to eat that, right? And maybe for other things like warmth or safety or whatever, stay near. So, you can kind of imagine that you could get all these complex behaviors just by having tons and tons of different sensors wired up different ways. And what gets kind of interesting at this point is, and maybe even before this point, honestly, is that you look at it, and if you were trying to describe the behavior of this vehicle, you might come up with all kinds of explanations. You might say, oh, it's got a concept of prey and a concept of food and a concept of safety or whatever. But in reality, it's just these wires, and they're all just, crisscrossed. They're keyed into certain sensors, and that's it. And that's what I think the beauty is of this kind of approach, of this kind of storybook, incrementally building approach, is that it shows you, that you can create this complex behavior, and inside it's just like nothing. I mean, it's just wires. Some are excitatory and some are inhibitory. So, I have some background in modeling animal behavior, and so I always think of animal behavior in these kinds of situations. And so, we're all familiar with this idea of a moth, right? And the moth kind of like goes around the light bulb, right? And it kind of spins around in circles. I mean, that's kind of similar to one of these vehicles, right? It's like, let's go towards the light. Uh-oh, don't see the light anymore. Kind of spin around. Oh, there's the light again. And so it's kind of, maintaining this distance from the light. Same kind of thing with circling sharks. I think these are sharks circling a raft or something in the ocean. And I think these actually get a little bit into like vehicle 4, which talks about maintaining a certain distance from the stimulus based on a non-monotonic response function. But basically the idea of the non-monotonic response function is that there's a certain place where the sensor is really firing, and it's the Goldilocks effect, and if you get too close or too far away, it doesn't fire as much. So there's a certain spot, which is the sweet spot, where it fires, and because of that, you tend to get a kind of orbit around the stimulus. As this one way of doing it. Okay, so let's talk about logic. So you can build this up and you can get logic. So what have we got? So we've got at the top we've got 3 simple networks. The first one on the left has got 3 nodes. You've got A, B, and C, right? C has a 1 in it. That indicates that it needs 1 unit of activation in order to fire, right? So if A is active and sends it 1 unit of activation, then C will fire. If A and B are active, right, with 1 unit of activation, A will send 1 unit to C, B will send -1 unit to C. The sum at C will be 0. C will not fire, right? So this is just the basic idea of it can if A is on and B is not on, then C will fire. But if they're both on, if A is on but B is not on, C will fire. But if they're both on, if A and B are both on, C will not fire. Okay, that's the basic idea of inhibition. You can think of the excitatory is sending like a positive number, and the inhibitory is sending a negative number. Okay. The second one in the middle, we've got D, E, and F. G has a threshold of 2. That means that 2 need to fire. So it can either be D and E, or it can be D and F, or it can be E and F, right? It just needs to be 2 of those 3, and then G will fire. It doesn't matter which 2, okay? And, forget about H. You guys get the basic idea. So you can also do these interesting things by chaining these things together in a serial fashion. And I'm going to talk about that more on the next slide. I'm going to break this one down. This one's a little bit simpler. All right. So think about this in terms of slices of time. There are 3 times that are interesting here. At time 1, the first node, going from left to right, has sufficient activation to fire. Okay? So it's received a unit of activation. The other nodes require 2, so none of them will fire. Only one will fire. Okay? One being the first one on the left. And I've got that indicated here by yes, no, no. That means that the first one has fired and the other 2 have not fired. Okay, at time 2, the first node is fired and has inhibited itself. So basically there's a line that goes out of the first one, and then it actually loops back around and inhibits itself. Okay, so it's fired and inhibited itself, but it sends some activation, 1 unit of activation, to the node in the middle, right? And the node in the middle is also continued to receive input activation, so it now has 2. So it has enough to fire, but the third one still doesn't. So now the pattern is no, yes, no. On the third time, right? The second node fires and inhibits the first node. The second node sends inhibition to the third node, and the third node receives enough to fire. Okay, so basically you can imagine like there's a pulse that's traveling through this thing, and it's like lighting up one, lighting up the next, lighting up the next. Because as each one in the chain fires, it inhibits the previous one. That's the basic kind of idea. Okay, so there was a lot of discussion about this. I feel slightly bad because I'm not really going to summarize the discussion from the standpoint of I felt like there was a lot of confusion about what the meaning of this reading was, and you guys made good points, but I also just felt like it was probably better for me just to like break it down and kind of highlight what the big important messages are. So when you think about these vehicles, the thing to think about is that in contrast with the previous readings where we've talked about like if-then rules, and we've talked about concepts, and we talked about all these things, if you look at the vehicles and how they behave, you can come up with a description where you could say, oh, this vehicle is following a rule. Like this vehicle likes light, or if this vehicle sees light, it will go to it. And that rule is pretty much correct, right? But if you look inside the vehicle, there's no rule there. There's nothing in the vehicle that obviously says that rule. Well, then you ask, where does the rule actually come from? So part of that is this kind of anthropomorphism, where we're basically seeing something and we're imagining that it is like a person. And we're giving a person-like or human-like explanation to what it's doing. And people do this all the time, and people do this with their dogs. Like a dog is not a person, but we'll attribute person-like attributes to a dog. And by the way, I have a dog, and I love my dog and everything like that, so don't think I hate animals. But that's just anthropomorphism. And if you do that to something that's like a machine, that's even more clearly a kind of anthropomorphism, right? So where does the rule-like behavior actually come from? Well, this is where it gets really interesting. So it's actually a giant, well, it's not a giant, it's actually a dynamical system that includes the environment that the vehicle is in, the structure of that environment, and the structure of the vehicle itself. So basically these two things are coupled and they kind of move together. So you have this energy that's coming from the environment. We're just like the solar panel analogy is a pretty good one. So you've got this light energy that's coming from the environment, and depending on where that light is in the environment, which is like the structure of the environment, and depending on how the vehicle is wired up, the vehicle is either going to move towards it or move away from it or do something else. So that's the kind of idea. It's like the behavior, this kind of rule-like behavior is emerging from the interaction of the vehicle with the environment. And that's kind of like a hard concept. I mean, that gets into like dynamical systems and differential equations and stuff. But I think it's really important to like pause at this point in our readings and kind of reflect on, what's the reality of the kind of mental representation and so forth that we've been talking about. Because at the end of the day, our brains are just like really complex. I would argue our brains are like really complex vehicles. We just have tons and tons and tons of these wires. They're all crisscrossed, they're all hooked up together. It creates some really, really complex behavior. But there's not really like one place that you can point to in our brains and say, oh, that's where the rule for making coffee is. That's where X is, that's where Y is. I mean, there's some localization in some ways, and so I'm kind of maybe pushing that a little bit too hard, but at the same time, I think it's more fair to think about it this way, the kind of vehicle way, than it is to think that there's a grandmother cell in your brain that represents your grandmother. So just that's the basic idea, and if you guys want, I posted some additional links on the discussion. All right, thanks.